Good afternoon, everyone in sunny San Diego. This is Jenna Rollicki, and I'm excited to be facilitating this session for you all. Today, we're going to be talking about formative assessment in higher education, a topic today that I think is even more relevant than ever. So I know a lot of instructors, obviously around the United States and around the world, have found themselves in the rare time that they are teaching online courses for the first time ever, potentially, which has of course led to many justifiable concerns about how this move ultimately impacts the quality of both teaching as well as student learning. So I'm excited to kind of be walking through this session with you all today. Additionally, before we go ahead and get started, I am going to just start off by doing a little poll for us. So I'm going to also have you guys indicate, and you'll be able to see that I'm going to launch a poll. So throughout the session today, I'm going to be incorporating some formative assessment pieces as well. So today I'm going to start us off with a poll, and then we're going to launch right into the session after I do a brief introduction of just myself. So our first question of the day, and you're going to notice that it's going to kind of pop up on your screen here, and it is all around whether or not you have used formative assessment as a part of your teaching process before. So I'll give you all a second to go ahead and answer that. All right, based on initial responses, it looks like there is about 48% of individuals who have used formative assessment before, about 48% that aren't sure if they have or not, and about 4% that haven't. So that's really great feedback, everybody. I'm going to use that to help me kind of formulate a little bit of my session as we go on throughout and what time I'll spend on what section. So thank you so much for that response. All right, so a little bit about myself. So my name is Jenna Rollicki. I am an enterprise consultant at Campus Labs. I have been with the company for about 7 years. You'll notice in the photo today, I am highlighting or featuring my dog. This is Crunch. You might hear him in the background because such is remote life these days. They like to bark. The mailman usually comes, just around the middle point of our session today. So again, I've been with Campus Labs for 7 years. I have a background in higher education. I have my master's in higher education and student affairs administration. A lot of your names look familiar. I've been on campus a couple of times conducting trainings on site. This was supposed to be on site, but of course, due to everything and the ever-changing kind of climate that we have going on in the United States right now, I was not able to make it out there, but I am very excited to be joining you all remotely. A little bit about our session overview. So just kind of giving us an idea of what we're going to be doing today. So first and foremost, we're going to do a very brief assessment overview. We're not going to spend a lot of time here, but I wanted to make sure that we all had the foundational knowledge needed in order to progress through the session today. Now, we're slotted to do about 90 minutes today. I'll probably come in a little bit under, so you might get a little bit of time back, but of course we'll have time for questions and things like that as well. From there, we're going to do a really deep dive into formative assessment. We're going to talk about the benefits of formative assessment, why it is important, different strategies, and even different tools that you all can use that are free and online. And then finally, I'm going to talk through some additional resources and address any questions that you all may have. Of course, we need to talk through our learning outcomes for today's session. So first and foremost, I am hopeful that you all will be able to describe at least 3 benefits of formative assessment specific to an online setting. I'm hoping that you all are going to be able to select at least 2 ways in which you can leverage formative assessment in an online format. And then finally, I really want you guys to think about creating a plan for adapting at least one method of feedback in your course. Now, before we get too far along, I do want to talk a little bit about continuous improvement. So this is where our second poll is going to come in. So I just want you to let me know if you're familiar with the model of continuous improvement.
as a result of the poll that we just did, which was around familiarity with the model of continuous improvement, 57% of you voted that you are not familiar with it, and 43% of you voted that you are. So that's a great start for us today to let me know how much time I'm going to focus on the model of continuous improvement. Before I do, though, I do want to talk through a little bit of pressures on higher education today. Of course, we all know that we have our regional accreditors who are looking for data and information. We have our lawmakers, our employers, our taxpayers, parents, departments, faculty, students. I mean, we can take this further, right? Alumni. I mean, right now we would definitely add COVID-19 to this board and our switch to online education. So there's a lot of pressure on higher education today. And part of the way that we work with campuses on dealing with that pressure is identifying the way in which they are interacting with the model of continuous improvement. So, this is the model of continuous improvement. You'll notice that it also is sometimes called the Plan, Do, Check, Act model as well. So if you're familiar with that terminology, but this is really the model that a number of our institutions use in order to inform their entire process on campus around assessment. So this is an ever-going kind of circle. You'll see it doesn't really end, right? You plan, you work on your foundational framework. So things that we're going to talk about today are goals and outcomes. So we're creating those outcomes, and then we are collecting the data and we're entering our findings and gathering evidence, which is where formative assessment comes in, right? And then we are checking that information, we're reflecting on it, we're making an action plan, and then we're acting on it. We're actually going through with that action plan and making shifts and adjustments. So the model of continuous improvement is something that we see a lot in higher education as a part of the framework in which institutions set up a lot of their processes around. So I just wanted to bring it up, make sure everybody was familiar with it, as I'll probably refer back to it a couple of times throughout the session today. Now, furthermore, I also am going to go through as we're kind of progressing through the series today. We do have a couple of worksheets on continuous improvement, so that's going to be one of the follow-up resources that I'm going to send along to you all so that you have access to that. Now, when we're thinking about the primary reason assessment is conducted at an institution, I want to kind of take us to this look. This is a survey that was done by Sam Houston, and you can see that the blank, right, the reason is depending on who responded, the different percent breakdowns of faculty and administrators. The primary reason for assessment was either accreditation or accountability, compliance with governmental mandates, improving student learning, or tradition. Now, today, we're all talking about a lot of improving student learning, which is the faculty rated that very high in the study that was conducted. And that's really where formative assessment lies. So when we're thinking about where does formative assessment impact and what is the primary reason for assessment, it is really going to be focused around that improving student learning. And this was just something that I thought was interesting that I like to highlight because it does kind of show to us kind of the distribution between what different stakeholders find is the primary reason for assessment. All right, I'm going to transition us quickly into learning outcomes. So, of course, I'm sure you all guessed it by now that I do have a really quick learning outcome poll. So, I just kind of want to get a feel for whether or not you all are regularly assessing the student learning outcomes for your course. So, I know a ton of us have course outcomes that we have likely created and are potentially measuring on a regular basis. So, I do also know that in some institutions I've worked with, they are monitoring them on more of a cycle, maybe looking at one outcome every year, and that outcome might cycle throughout the lifetime of the course. So I'll give you all a second to respond here. All right, it looks like the majority of you all have voted, and right now we're at 52% strongly agree and 48% agree. So that's great. You all are taking in your learning outcomes and ensuring that we are continuing to monitor them. So, in thinking about learning outcomes, we're going to do a super quick review of outcomes. Again, not going to spend a ton of time here, but do just want to make sure that we are setting that foundational level of knowledge. So, this is my favorite quote about student learning outcomes. It says, student learning is not the result of discrete experiences, but rather the product of many different kinds of experiences in and outside the classroom over an extended period of time. And I think the end of that portion is really important. Over an extended period of time. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not going to be happening within, one course instance, but certainly something that is going to persist over time. So again, just a little bit of an overview here. Outcomes assessment really helps to clarify divisional and departmental fit for a course. It really should be aligned to your institutional vision and mission, your goals, your strategic plans. I know campuses use a lot of different language, so kind of swap in whatever language you all are familiar with at San Diego Continuing Ed. It also helps to clarify to students and other constituents what a learner or a student can expect to gain and what the program is essentially going to accomplish. Outcomes assessment also provides different kinds of data and evidence about services, and it really strives to move beyond satisfaction. So we're not so worried about whether or not you like the course, but more or less what you learned during the course. And of course, we're trying to move beyond tracking. And we're really thinking more about describing how effective a course is based on the achievement of outcomes. Of course, outcomes assessment can also help us to close some of those silos that are established at some institutions between student affairs and academic affairs. Now, there is quite a difference between learning outcomes and program or operational outcomes, so I always like to highlight this part. So in here, when we have learning outcomes, we have it's very focused on the learner. It's very focused on the student or another stakeholder is to do or think as a result of a program, a course, or a service. Today's session, I know we are very highly focused around um, the faculty and your all interaction with formative assessment. But I do just want to point out here that um, you know, learning outcomes can be across an institution in many different spaces in programs and student affairs and our service efforts. So it's important to note that learning outcomes are happening across the institution. Now, program and operational outcomes, they really examine what a program or a process is to do to achieve or accomplish for its own improvement. And it's really usually focused around needs or satisfaction. Now, effective learning outcomes. So we all have course outcomes that are likely established for our courses that we're already teaching. Now, we might also have program outcomes, potentially, general education outcomes or institutional outcomes. But an effective learning outcome, no matter what it is really focused on the student or the learner. It focuses on learning resulting from an activity rather than the activity itself. It reflects again the institution's mission and values. It aligns at the course and program or academic program and department levels. It should focus mainly on skills and abilities central to the discipline. It should be general. Now, this part's hard. It should be general enough to capture important learning, but clear and specific enough to be measurable. And that piece is always a little bit tricky to have it be, general enough, but also be measurable. It should also focus on aspects of learning that will develop and endure, but that can be assessed in some form now. Now, really quickly, when we're thinking about learning outcomes, we should always be aligning to the larger institutional mission. So, and thinking about connecting to the larger picture. So we know that we might have things like institutional outcomes, department outcomes, program outcomes, and our achievement of those outcomes at our course level, which is kind of that base level of outcomes, is what is feeding and providing the data for our programs. Our course outcomes are providing the data for our departments, for our divisions, for our institution. So capturing this information and making it all connect is how we are able to tell as an institution whether or not we are fulfilling essentially what we promise to our students when they come to our institution, and we say this is what we are hoping you all are going to be gaining in terms of knowledge when you graduate. But as the courses, we know that we're providing a lot of that foundational information and essentially the information that will help them to achieve those outcomes. Now, like anything else, there's challenges, right? So students don't all experience college in a way that makes outcome assessment simple, especially at San Diego Continuing Ed, knowing your population and knowing how you all are, a certificate granting institution, you have different factors that are at play here. So of course, some learning outcomes are going to take months and years, potentially even a lifetime to manifest. Um, in terms of doing a survey to measure student learning outcome data, that is likely not going to cut it because assessing learning is much more time consuming. It is much more difficult than that. And it is, quite frankly, one of the most difficult things to assess when it comes to participating in forms of assessment. It can be even difficult to identify what it is you want students to learn. Now, in thinking about structuring and creating learning outcomes, so this is something we're just going to go over again super briefly, but there's kind of three M's to outcomes. There's meaningful, so how does the outcome support the departmental mission or goal or program or course? It has to be manageable. So is the outcome realistic? This is something we come back to a lot. Is it possible that what I'm asking my students to achieve in my one course for this one term, is it realistic? Are they able to gain that knowledge? Will I be able to prove whether or not they did achieve this outcome, which is where measurement comes in, right? So how are we going to measure the student learning outcome, and how will you know if the outcome is going to be achieved? Now, this is the measurable part. This is where we're starting to think about different assessment methods, of which formative assessment is one of them. So again, kind of building that foundational level and thinking through, especially in the outcome space, how can we leverage formative assessment to begin to determine whether or not our learners are achieving the student learning outcomes that we have set forth. Now, there's of course a structure for everything. So there's a structure for the way in which you can write a learning outcome. So, audience, condition, behavior, and degree are all four components of a learning outcome. And you can see here, it's also known as the ABCD structure. I'm sure you all have heard of it. It is something that is very popular in higher education, and really a way in which we look to create quality learning outcome statements. Now, to really just establish this, so the audience or the students will be able to B, learn what, C, under what circumstances or conditions, and then D, to this level of efficiency or effectiveness. Now, in thinking about writing learning outcomes, we always think about Bloom's taxonomy. So, Bloom's taxonomy is essentially a a guide that you all can use in order to determine what assessment methods should be used to identify the level of learning that has occurred. So when you're asking your students to provide you with evidence, you're going to need to be able to make a statement about the learning that had occurred, and using Bloom's taxonomy as a way to incorporate some language in order to align essentially a activity with a verb. So if we're looking here, we are thinking about, this probably looks familiar. There's all different types of charts of Bloom's taxonomy, but this one is pretty popular. So there's different levels of knowledge, different levels of Bloom's taxonomy, and we're starting the base level, remembering. So really asking students to recall relevant information. So asking them to choose something, to define something, to identify something. This is very base level. This is low level learning. Then we get to understanding. So we're asking them to classify something, to compare something, to make sense of what they've learned. Then there's applying. So again, we're going up in the chain here. So applying is all about organizing, performing, connecting. And then we have analyzing, which is distinguishing, establishing, finding, researching, really breaking the concepts into parts and understanding how each part is related or correlates to another. then evaluating, so making judgments based on a set of guidelines, adapting, combining, proposing, extending. These are different types of things that we'd be able to incorporate into those learning outcome statements. And then finally, creating. So designing, providing, validating, persuading, right? Different levels of Bloom's taxonomy is going to be appropriate for different courses and different course outcomes. Now, I'm just going to kind of wrap us up with learning outcomes today by indicating that I'll be sending you all a resource on a learning outcome worksheet that will help you all in potentially either analyzing the current learning outcomes that you all have created, or even potentially helping you to create some new ones. Now, when we're thinking about assessing learning outcomes, specifically, of course, program outcomes too, but we're really focused on learning today. We first want to determine your outcomes, and based on the poll information that you all have already provided, most of you or all of you replied that you are regularly assessing your outcomes, which means you have outcomes. So you have already done step one. Congratulations to all of you. You've already determined your outcomes, and the next step is really going to be to determine your methods. So methods are going to bring us directly into formative assessment. Before it does, though, I do want to talk quickly about what type of data you're going to need. So we're either going to need quantitative data or we're going to need qualitative data, or it may not really matter for us what type of data we need. We may just need feedback in the moment. So let's think about this. Qualitative data, is something that can be expressed as a number, or it can be quantified. It's really easy to report and analyze. It is pretty easy to construct. It doesn't involve as much time. Quantitative is where we're looking for more of text or narrative from respondents. It definitely has a lot more depth to it. It is much more robust. So think about how much time you have when you're thinking about formative assessment as we get into that session, because knowing what type of data you need might be really closely tied to the amount of time that you have. So that's kind of why I wanted to highlight the qualitative and the quantitative, because we are going to need to think about that. And I'm actually noticing now that I have my titles of these two columns reversed. So I'll adjust that before I send you all the PDF of these. But quantitative should be on our left-hand side and qualitative should be over our right. So I apologize for that.